Morning, everybody. We start today's session.
Good morning.
Señor Marroquín, buenos días.
Good morning, Mr. Marroquín. You have a statement before you, if you could please read it out. Yes, good morning. I solemnly declare upon my honor and conscience that I will tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Salinas is going to be conducting the examination.
Mr. Salinas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Morning, Mr. Marroquín. Mr. Marroquín, take it from your witness statements that at one point you were asked to preside a high-level commission that would address certain issues that existed between FEWA and Ferrovías.
Towards the end of the first quarter of 2006.
Tell the tribunal what the origin of that commission was?
After the petition from the President for me to take charge of that commission, the partners in Ferrovías had dealings at high level, and as a result of the exchange, they asked me to follow up on the issues.
When you say that Ferrovías had contacts at the highest level, can you tell the tribunal what you mean by that?
Yes, I understand that Ferrovías had meetings with the presidency and other important positions in the government, and given what was discussed in those meetings, in which I did not participate, but I understand that they were carried out, I was asked to take charge of the high-level commission to make viable the whole question of the railway.
Now, sir, is it your recollection that those meetings happened between March and May of 2006?
The meetings of the commission? Yes.
And
Could you please repeat? Señor Marroquín, yo sé que me está escuchando en inglés y me está respondiendo.
Wait after my question just a few seconds to answer so that the interpretation can get in there. We'd appreciate it.
Yes, I'd be pleased to do so.
Whether it was your recollection that the high-level commission meetings happened between March and May of 2006.
That's right.
In those meetings, sir, there's been some testimony at this hearing that there were many issues discussed, not just a single issue. Can you explain to the tribunal why there were a number of issues discussed during the meetings and what the purpose of those discussions were?
Señor Marroquín, perdón, le voy a interrumpir nuevamente porque estamos teniendo problemas.
I'm going to interrupt you once again. There are some. Can you please repeat the answer once again? Now, can you hear me better?
Let me repeat the question.
Por favor.
Please.
In these meetings, there's been some testimony at this hearing that there were many issues discussed, not just a single issue. Can you explain to the tribunal why there were a number of issues discussed during the meetings and what the purpose of those discussions was?
The purpose of the commission that was under my responsibility was to make viable rail operations in the country. Obviously, that entails a certain complexity in and of itself, plus the rail operations, and in this case, the contracts in force with Ferrovías were three. In effect, one thing was tied to the other. Therefore, throughout the meetings, at least the ones that I chaired, several topics were touched upon.
Now you say, sir, that one thing was tied to the other in the context of three contracts. Can you tell the tribunal if during the meetings that you were present and during the commission that you chaired, was there ever, or did you ever receive an instruction from anyone in the government to negotiate or settle only if all points could be negotiated and settled, or was the government, as represented by you and others in that commission, free to negotiate whatever issues could be resolved at any given time?
Sí, ante la primera pregunta, no, yo no tenía instrucciones.
In terms of the first question, I did not have instructions to resolve everything altogether in a comprehensive package. The purpose was to make viable rail operations. I don't know if this answers your second question.
It does, sir. Now, when you say that the purpose was to make the viable rail operations, what do you mean by that? What was your understanding of the issues that the parties were facing at that time?
Entiendo que había, obviamente,
I understand that there was an absence of rail operations in the country that would have enabled the economy to have an alternative for logistical transportation. I understand that that was precisely what was sought, or that was my understanding, that what the counterpart at the high-level commission sought. That is to say that that such operations could become an alternative for transportation in Guatemala, and therefore all of the time we were trying to come up with a formula or a work plan or a revised operational plan that would make it possible to reach that point.
Sir, draw your attention and your recollection to the meeting, the high-level commission meeting that took place in 11 May 2006. Are you sort of placed in time? There's been some testimony that the
sí,
Yes, I do remember it.
Sure. Now, there's been some testimony that the government wielded in its negotiations with Ferrovias the declaration of lesivo of the equipment contract, the usufruct equipment contract, as sort of as a pressure mechanism, as a pressure tool to get concessions or further negotiations on other issues with Ferrovias. What can you say about that in the context of your negotiations within the high-level commission meeting?
sí, en el contexto de la Comisión de Alto Nivel bajo.
Yes, in the context of the high-level commission under my responsibility. Oh, I'm sorry. I need to wait. Sorry. You can answer. Thank you. In the context of the high-level commission under my responsibility, first, I didn't have any knowledge of the question of lesividad until that meeting, and second, it wasn't my instruction nor my way of negotiating to have to be pressuring or to anticipating or conditioning aspects of negotiation based on one issue, and that wasn't my instruction. It wasn't how I had intended to go about the negotiation.
Now, sir, you say that you didn't know until that point, meaning the May 11, 2006 meeting. Is that correct?
Es correcto.
How did you?
That is correct.
¿Ves? Podríamos, si quiere apague el
If you'd like, you could turn off the microphone, and every time he asks you, you could then put it back, turn it back on.
I think it's the issue of understanding and then trying to respond, and I appreciate that. I was saying, you mentioned that you hadn't found out until there about the meeting of May 11, 2006. How did you find out, and how was the issue dealt with during that meeting?
En efecto,
In effect, at that meeting, I took note of this process of lesividad at the time that we were put on notice by the other party, Ferrovias, and this made it such that I suspended the meeting at a certain point in time, and I went out to look into that matter with the Competitiveness Commissioner, Miguel Fernandez, who confirmed it for me. But for the sake of maintaining the goodwill or the framework for negotiation, Commissioner Fernandez suggested and offered that he would make an effort to suspend the lesividad process so that we could continue at the high-level negotiating table working.
Do you know, sir, what was Ferrovias' reaction to that offer and statement from Commissioner Fernandez at that point?
Could you explain the question a bit further?
How did Ferrovias react to Commissioner Fernandez's offer to put the Lesivo process on hold so that negotiations could continue?
Bueno, sí fue.
Well, it was some time ago that we had this meeting, but first, obviously, there was an issue having to do with the having learned that there was a lesividad process, but I would suppose that in the face of our offer, there was at least some degree of appreciation that we, as high-level commission, wanted to have clear and constructive negotiations.
Counselor, after the high-level commission ceased its work, did you have occasion to again become involved somehow with the Ferrovías issue?
Sí, en efecto.
Yes, in effect, in due course, the local partners of Ferrovías, I understand, asked for a study. And when that study had results, I was asked to attend a presentation of them.
When you say local partner, sir, do you know who asked for that study?
Mi entendimiento.
My understanding is that it was Cementos Progreso.
And with regards to that study, sir, you say that you were given a presentation. Do you recall what the import of that presentation was?
Mesoamerica, which is the consulting firm that made the presentation, made a review, particularly of economic and financial considerations of rail operations, and finally made some suggestions about how one could render operations viable in those terms, that is to say, economic financial terms. But those economic and financial considerations were based on premises that were quite weak, or in any event that required additional efforts from the state, be it fiscal or efforts or subsidy. As I say, financial premises that really were not consistent with reality.
Sir, do you know why Cementos Progreso asked for that study to be done?
I would assume that it was to get more objective information on how to actually make rail operations viable. And
He's stating testimony based on assumption, not based on personal knowledge. It's not competent testimony.
If he knows. That was the question.
If he knows, but not if he's not, shouldn't be assuming.
I believe counsel's objection is to the witness's answer, not my question.
Conteste la pregunta en la...
answer the question to the extent that you know.
Thank you. Mr. Marroquin, did you have occasion to speak to anyone at Cementos Progreso about why they commissioned this study?
Sí, tuve la posibilidad de hablar.
Yes, I did have an opportunity to speak with them in due course, yes.
What did they tell you about why they commissioned that study?
Porque tenían el interés.
Because they had an interest, as I say, in coming up with an objective reference to establish whether rail operations would actually be viable or profitable.
Now, apologies that I take you back in time now that we've gone forward, but did you, while you were at the high-level commission, have occasion to discuss with Ferrovías their outlook and outlook of investment and profitability and request information of that sort, and what was the result of those interactions?
Yes, the issue of the Ferrovia data was something that we sought out so as to be able to establish properly and technically what the realistic ways of rehabilitating rail operations would be. But in the course of the meetings, at least the ones that I chaired, the high-level meetings, we never had an opportunity to see those figures or those cash flows or other elements that might make it possible to establish an operational plan or a business plan that would be viable into the future.
So do you recall what the conclusion of that Mesoamerica report was?
In brief, Mesoamerica suggested that financially, economically, what might make rail operations viable would be either subsidized interest rates or fiscal efforts on the part of the government in different forms. Those would be the two main conclusions. Consequently, there were certain conditioning factors that were not very realistic for making rail operations viable.
Other questions?
Thank you. Mr. Stan.
Thank you, Mr. President. Good morning, Mr. Marroquin.
Buenos días.
I believe we
Good morning.
talked to each other last time you were here,
Sí, recuerdo.
last year.
Yes, I remember.
You were asked by your counsel on direct examination questions about the Mesoamerica study. And this study was conducted by Mesoamerica after the government had published the La Ceiba Declaration, correct?
Así entiendo.
I understand that that is the case.
So it's fair to say that the conclusions of the study that you testified about could not have been a basis for the declaration of La Ceiba, correct?
¿Podría
Could you repeat the question, please?
The conclusions of the Mesoamerica study, the study was conducted after the declaration of La Ceiba, correct?
Así es.
That's right.
As a matter of logic, the Mesoamerica study's conclusions could not have been a basis for the declaration of La Ceiba that was issued in August of 2006, correct?
Asumiría que así es.
I would assume that that's the case.
As you testified, this study was not conducted at the request of Ferrovías, but at the request of Cementos Progreso, correct?
Entendería que
I would understand that it was asked for by Cementos Progreso as part of its partnership with Ferrovías.
Did you ever speak with anyone from Ferrovías to tell you that they had asked for the Mesoamerica to conduct this study?
con las
With my apologies, but if to the panel, but if Cementos was a partner of Ferrovías, then I assumed that if I was speaking with Cementos, I was also speaking with Ferrovías.
Did you ever ask anyone from Ferrovías that they had asked for Cementos Progreso to request this study?
solo para
Just to be clear on the question is whether I had any awareness that Ferrovías was in agreement with Cementos Progreso in asking for the study. That I don't know, because I was invited in a meeting to establish the technical solidity of the results of Mesoamerica's work, but I don't know what else might have happened.
And so you went to this meeting with other government officials sometime in November 2006 to see a presentation on the Mesoamerica study?
así es.
That is correct.
And, at this meeting, the representatives of Mesoamerica, according to your statement, gave an hour-and-a-half PowerPoint presentation on its study?
Más o menos en ese
It was that time was more or less that. Yes, that's right.
And they gave a PowerPoint presentation, correct?
la presentación que dieron fue en efecto de
Yes, in effect, they did give a PowerPoint presentation.
Just to be clear, this presentation that you saw, this PowerPoint presentation, occurred over 5 years ago, right?
sí es noviembre de 2006.
Yes, November of 2006, 5 years.
There were no members, representatives of Ferrovías at this presentation, correct?
Me imagino que ustedes de Ferrovías, parte administrativa.
I imagine that in terms of Ferrovias administrative counterparts at the higher level commission, no.
Well, my question was a little simpler. Was there any,
Bueno, mi pregunta fue más sencilla.
my question was simple or straightforward. Were there any representatives from Ferrovias present at the November 2006 meeting that you went to?
No que yo recuerde.
Not that I recall.
Now, you were never provided with a copy of the Mesoamerica study.
Excuse me. Can he repeat the answer, please?
No que
Not that I recall.
Okay. And let me repeat my next question. You were never provided with a copy of the Mesoamerica study, correct?
es correcto.
That is correct.
Provided with a copy of the PowerPoint presentation that you saw in November 2006, correct?
Not personally. It wasn't given to me.
In fact, isn't it true that you've never seen the actual written Mesoamerica study?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
You've seen with regard to the Mesoamerica study is the PowerPoint presentation you saw 5 years ago, correct?
Repetidamente es correcto.
Yes, it is correct.
And do you know for a fact whether there actually is a written Mesoamerica study?
For a fact, de hecho, sí conozco.
For a fact, yes, I do know, in fact, that there is a written Mesoamerica study.
And the basis for that is because you saw the PowerPoint presentation, correct?
No.
No, the basis of knowing that there's such a study is that, in effect, the counterparts of Cementos Progreso assert this or indicate this.
Okay, so, but you've never actually seen the document that is the Mesoamerica study, correct?
Me parece que es así.
I believe I already said that. I did not see the report.
To the continued line, because it's been asked and answered at least 4 times now.
Okay, now in your second statement, you state that, and this is paragraph 7 of your second statement, you state that despite the fact that I do not have the study handy at this time, I perfectly remember that the conclusion of the study was that the Guatemalan Railway was simply not profitable in the way Ferrovias planned to operate it. You recall saying that in your second statement? It's up there on the screen there.
Sí, recuerdo.
Yes, I do remember having said this, and I remember that that was the conclusion that I reached from that presentation. Do I need to repeat it?
No. Now, by not profitable, the words you use in your statement, you're talking about accounting profits for Ferrovias?
Una operación
An operation that is not profitable, not viable, is an operation in general that's not viable. But if you want a specification, perhaps you could repeat the question in terms of just so that I can be clear on just what your specific doubt is.
I'm trying to understand what you meant by not profitable in your statement. Profitable in terms of what?
que no habían ingresos.
That there wasn't sufficient revenue to cover the costs, neither the operating or the financial costs.
How many years are you referring to here? What was your understanding of how many years are not profitable based on the study?
No entiendo la pregunta.
I don't understand the question.
The railroad was not profitable. This was a.
Señor Marroquín, excuse me. Can you repeat again the answer, please?
Sí, no entendí.
Yes, I did not understand, or I don't understand the question.
I'm just trying to drill down on what you meant by not profitable in your statement. When you said not profitable, are you referring to the operations of the railway to date were not profitable, or that the railway was not going to be profitable at any time over the remaining 40 2 years of the usufruct.
Just to clarify, the witness has testified about what the presentation of the Mesoamerica report was about, not what his opinion on the profitability of the enterprise was. I just want to make sure that the record is clear, because counsel keeps saying, when you say profitable, did you mean over 42 years of the usufruct? Just want to make that clear.
En base
Based on what Mesoamerica presented, the railway was not profitable as of the date of operation, and it was likely that it was not going to be profitable unless the government made the fiscal sacrifices or unless there was a subsidized financial rate in order to make it profitable, whether it's 5, 10, or 20 years. I'm not a financial expert. I've worked in finance. I've worked in investment projects, and that's why I'm clear that if you don't have a subsidized rate, if there's not a fiscal effort on the part of the government, then there wasn't going to be profitability of the operation in the future, and certainly there wasn't profitability in terms of how it was being operated at that time, based on what I was able to see and conclude.
I want to focus on, in your seventh paragraph, your second statement, you wrote that the conclusion, I remember that the conclusion of the study was that in the manner as Ferrovías planned to operate the railway in Guatemala, the railroad was simply not profitable. Was it your understanding that the Mesoamerica study only focused on the railway operations of the usufruct when they were referring to in the manner as Ferrovías planned to operate the railway?
me podría
Could you repeat the question, please, so I can be sure that I give you an appropriate answer?
In the manner as Ferrovías planned to operate the railway, those words that you used in your statement there, what was your understanding as to what that was referring to? Was it referring to the operation of the railway?
Sí, en efecto, nosotros
In effect, we had a mandate to make rail operations viable, and I focused my attention on that.
Whether the Mesoamerica study considered how Ferrovías could profit from the real estate component of the usufruct, correct?
no pudiera pronunciarme sobre eso.
I couldn't say anything about that. It would be a bit speculative. I don't have any basis to properly make a statement on that issue. Though, if the tribunal would allow me, that was also just what we were trying to establish during the high-level meetings. What were the elements that Ferrovías had in general? That was an important issue, but we were never able to determine it.
Now, you had no involvement in the preparation of the Mesoamerica study, correct?
I did not.
And you have no idea what assumptions or inputs went into the study, do you?
I wouldn't know how to answer that question. Could you please repeat the question so that I am able to answer the question more appropriately?
Well, do you know what assumptions or inputs were put into the Mesoamerica study?
Of course, the ones that Mesoamerica presented in its presentation. It based itself on a number of premises, and it reached certain conclusions. It is a financial and technical study.
It was what kind of a study?
A financial and technical study.
Okay, well, sitting here today, can you tell us what those assumptions and inputs were in the Mesoamerica study?
No,
I don't know if you would like a full list, but as I said, I saw the study only, and I looked at it only in general terms, and the premises and the conjectures in which Mesoamerica included, I wouldn't be able to describe. These are things that are a bit more objective. I don't think I would have the possibility of describing them appropriately.
You can't describe them appropriately because you don't know, do you, sir? As you sit here today.
No entiendo.
I don't understand the kind of suggestion by you. If you were talking about a premise, for example, to work under a subsidized rate from the financial viewpoint, if by assumption or premise you are talking about making efforts by the government, yes, I remember. Those were not so much the premises, but the conclusions of the study, as far as I can remember.
Okay, but I'm asking about not the conclusions which you've testified to. I'm just asking, as you sit here today.
Grosso modo.
Excuse me, let me just
Sure,
finish my
sure.
question. As you sit here today, can you tell us what were the assumptions, as you recall, what were the assumptions and inputs into the Mesoamerica study?
As far as I can remember, there were premises in connection with cargo volumes, passengers, and projections of that nature in the business.
Anything else you recall?
No, I would be speculating, and this is what I can say appropriately because that is the basis of the exercise of Mesoamerica, to establish the technical and financial viability of the railroad.
Do you know where Mesoamerica obtained information from in order to prepare the study?
I would not be able to speak appropriately about that. I don't know where they got the information.
So you don't know whether they got any information from Ferrovias, correct?
I would not be able to answer the question appropriately.
And you don't know whether they, in the course of preparing the study, they spoke to anyone from Ferrovias, correct?
Objection, asked and answered.
No.
You asked the broader question, which is where they got the information. He's already told you he doesn't know.
Right, but my question was whether he spoke to anyone, not whether he got information from them.
Por favor, responda a la pregunta.
Please answer the question. I would not be able to say that appropriately.
Turn to the May 11th, 2006 commission meeting, a high-level commission meeting which you testified about. As you state in your first statement, and I believe you stated in response to Mr. Salinas' questions, at the May 11th meeting, that was the first time you learned that there was an ongoing Licividad process against one of Ferrovias' contract, correct?
Es correcto.
Yes, that's correct.
And you were surprised.
Señor Marroquín, perdón, ¿puede volver a...?
Es correcto.
Yes, that's correct.
And you were quite surprised when you learned about this at this meeting, correct?
That is correct.
And you were surprised because you, as someone who was chairing the meetings on behalf of the government, this would have been important information for you to know in conducting your discussions and negotiations with Ferrovias, wouldn't it?
I don't know how to answer your question. Would you please clarify it so that I could give you a more appropriate answer to your question?
Well, sure. In conducting what you describe in your statements in good faith negotiations with Ferrovias during these meetings, you, as person chairing the meetings, certainly would have thought it was you would have preferred to have known in advance of conducting those meetings that there was an ongoing Licividad process against one of Ferrovias' contracts, wouldn't you?
As a person responsible for a high-level commission, well, the more information one has, the better, in order for one to be able to manage the responsibilities that were assigned to one. We had worked for a few months, and we were in this process of collecting information. But to answer your question, yes, this is something that surprised me, and it's something that I would have liked to know at the time. But I was then informed of it at that time.
Were you upset about the fact that you hadn't been informed about it prior to the May 11th meeting?
Estaba,
I was at least surprised.
But not upset.
como responsable,
As a person responsible for a negotiation, one should not become emotional. One should try and find a solution to the problem.
And after you found out about this information from someone from Ferrovias, correct?
Ferrovias informed me of this at the table, and then I corroborated all this with Commissioner Fernandez. Yes, that's the way it was.
And when you talked about corroborating with Commissioner Fernandez, that was done over the telephone in a private conversation with him, correct? It wasn't at the meeting in general.
sí,
Yes, Susan Pineda came with me. We left the meeting to talk to Commissioner Fernandez to verify the information that had been given to us by the counterpart Ferrovias.
And then you went to talk to Commissioner Fernandez over the telephone to corroborate or confirm what you had learned at the meeting about the lesividad ongoing against one of Ferrovias' contracts. Is that right?
así es.
Yes, that is correct.
And Arturo Gramajo was at this meeting, correct?
Así es correcto.
That is correct, yes.
And when the representatives of Ferrovias disclosed what they had learned about the lesividad process ongoing against one of its contracts, Dr. Gramajo didn't say anything about that at the meeting, correct?
I do not recall exactly that fact.
Well, certainly Dr. Gramajo didn't confirm anything that Ferrovias said about what they had learned at the meeting. You had to go talk to Commissioner Fernandez to confirm that, correct?
Sí, nosotros fuimos con sus...
Yes, Susan Pineda and I went to confirm this with Commissioner Fernandez.
Now, after your call with Mr. Fernandez, didn't you tell Mr. Bill Duggan of Ferrovias that if what you had heard about the lesividad declaration against one of FEG's contracts was going on, then the government was not in your opinion, the government was not negotiating in good faith and you no longer wanted to be part of the commission?
No, yo no dije eso.
I did not say that in those words.
What did you say to Mr. Duggan?
The official communication was that after the conversation with Mr. Fernandez, Commissioner Fernandez was going to make sure that he was going to keep on hold lesividad so that our high-level commission could continue negotiating. As a consequence, this is what I always suggested and that I stated during my mandate, that I was going to negotiate in good faith. And after confirming this with Mr. Fernandez, that is to say that there was a lesividad process that was ongoing, we had to continue upkeeping the negotiation, and Commissioner Fernandez, at our request, was going to try to put that on hold, or try to.
Okay, so if Mr. Duggan testified that you told him after you had your conversation with Mr. Fernandez that if what you had learned from Ferrovias about lesividad was true, that in your opinion the government was not negotiating in good faith and that you no longer wanted to be part of the commission.
I do not recall having made that comment in those words to Mr. Duggan.
Okay, well, did you say words to that effect to Mr. Duggan?
Not to Mr. Duggan.
Did you say it to someone else?
We made comments about the meeting with other people, yes.
Okay, but my questions were about those specific statements that Mr. Duggan said you made to him. Did you make those types of comments to anyone else?
No hice comentarios en esa línea.
I did not make any comments along those lines, and I certainly did not make those comments to Mr. Duggan.
But it's true, is it not, that after the May 11th meeting, according to your statement, you had nothing further to do with the high-level commission, correct?
Luego de las reuniones de mayo,
After the May meeting, yes, indeed, I left the high-level commission.
Okay, and why did you leave the high-level commission?
There were a number of reasons related to the work plans of the Government Plan Presidential Commission, amongst others, is that at that time we started working on the task force on country qualification, and I was the person responsible for that. And then there were other issues that required my attention. And there were a number of people involved with the commission as well, and my value added perhaps was better assigned to other duties.
Okay, now, you are aware, aren't you, that after the May 11th high-level commission meeting, the next face-to-face negotiation meeting between representatives of the government and Ferrovias did not take place till August 24th, 2006?
yo no.
I wouldn't be able to talk with much propriety after May because I was no longer the primary responsible person for that process.
And you were not at the August 24th, 2006 meeting, correct?
To the best of my recollection and knowledge, no.
And you have no knowledge about what the government proposed or demanded from Ferrovias at that meeting with regard to the issues between the parties?
No, no tendría conocimiento o información.
I would have no knowledge, nor would I have information about it. I would have no knowledge, nor would I have any knowledge about that.
Okay. I have no further questions at this time.
Mr. Salinas.
Very briefly, Mr. President. Mr. Marroquin, Mr. Stern asked you about the May 11th, 2006 high-level commission meeting. You recall those questions?
Sí, me acuerdo en general.
Yes, in general, I remember.
And as you told me, that you did not have any knowledge about the internal Lesivo process that was being pursued at that time until you were informed by representatives of Ferrovias at that meeting. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Is it your understanding, sir, or do you know whether the Ferrovias representatives at that meeting knew about the Lesivo process from before that meeting? Or was that the first they had heard, at least from your perception at that meeting?
No podría indicarlo.
I wouldn't be able to indicate that, but I remember that they were the ones who put forth this issue at the meeting.
Now, sir, if you didn't know about the Lesivo process before the May 11th, 2006 high-level commission meeting, could you possibly have used that Lesivo process as a pressure mechanism or threat during the prior meetings of the high-level commission?
No en lo absoluto. Perdón.
No, absolutely not.
And if FEG didn't know about the Lesivo process prior to that May 11, 2006 meeting, could they have felt pressured by that Lesivo process to make concessions prior to the May 11, 2006 meeting?
Diría que no.
I would say no.
Now, just so that there are no doubts, Mr. Marroquin, Mr. Stern asked you about your reasons for moving on onto different duties within the, I struggled what the word is, but the commissioner's office that you worked at that time. And I just want to ask you straight on, did you move on to other duties because of your opinions as to how the government proceeded internally to pursue the Lesivo process?
I had to adjust to decisions made by the commissioner and to government priorities. And consequently, I left the high-level commission, and this was agreed with the other commissioners, and I became responsible of other duties.
Anything to do with your own opinions about how the Lesivo process had been handled?
Realmente,
My opinion on lesividad was unconsequential. No tengo.
Just a couple of very quick factual questions.
I've just got one question. You say at the end of your second statement that Ferrovias was not adequately prepared to fulfill its obligation to restore the railroad in Guatemala. What were the circumstances which made you reach that conclusion?
cuando
I assume that we are making reference to the Mesoamerica study when Mesoamerica presented its numbers. And it presented the ways to facilitate or make more profitable this operation. Mesoamerica submitted a number of rates that did not exist in the market at that time. Therefore, a subsidy was required. That's example number one. Example number two, in connection with income to cover costs, it required the state to make fiscal efforts to cover costs. That would be example number two. And we are talking about a situation in the future, a forward-looking situation.
But neither of those points related to the willingness or ability of Ferrovias, did they? They were questions of government support, which may not have been available, but that's different.
yo me estoy pronunciando
I am talking about the figures and the conclusions. I cannot comment about the willingness or attitude of Ferrovias. I was making a comment in connection with the numbers and the conclusions put forth in the Mesoamerica study.
When you had your conversation on May 11th with Commissioner Fernandez, and you learned about the Lesividad process, did he tell you the specific reasons why Lesividad was being sought, and did he ask you, as in your responsibility with the Commission, to focus on solving those specific problems?
Commissioner Fernandez did not give me many reasons related to the Lesividad process, but he was supportive for us to have a constructive negotiation environment, and that is why he tried to put the declaration on hold. He offered to do it, and that is what we're looking for at the Commission, to have an environment that would allow us to solve the problems that existed.
Give you the reasons why the government was seeking that and ask you to solve those.
no en ese momento.
The last
Not at that time.
On on page 3 of my statement, but it's paragraphs 7 and 8 of your first statement, you mentioned and you've elaborated that the goal of the commission was to reestablish railroad operations. And in paragraph 8, you give a number of subjects, some 8 subjects that were on the table for the commission. Is that correct?
Es correcto.
That is correct.
And in your opinion, was it necessary in order to have the reestablishment of a functioning railroad, the resolution of these issues?
En general,
In general, yes.
And if you had known, if you had only solved the issue of the alleged defects that gave rise to the Lesivo process in the 143 and 158 contracts, would that have achieved the objective of the commission to establish or reestablish railroad operations?
Would the arbitrator be able to repeat the question so I'm able to answer your question appropriately?
If you had known about what the specific defects were that were giving rise to Lesivo for the equipment process, equipment contract, would that solution have been sufficient to reestablish railroad operations, or would you have also needed to solve the other issues?
no era suficiente.
It would not have been enough. It would also have been necessary to address other issues.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Salinas.
Just one question, Mr. President, on Secretary Eisenstadt's last question. Mr. Marroquin, what is your understanding of where the, or at least some of the concerns you outline in paragraph 8 came from and why they came to the attention of the Commission?
Estos temas se fueron.
These issues were being defined jointly by Ferrovías and by the government to establish the issues that should be addressed to make viable the operation of the railroad.
So, for example, sir, the issue of the squatters, which is point 2 in your paragraph 8, and issue number 1, which was payments to the trust fund, were those payments that were of interest to Ferrovías or to Guatemala?
Yes, items 1 and 2 were of the interest of Ferrovías, our counterpart.
Further questions, Mr. President?
Thank you. Mr. Stern?
I have no further questions.
Thank you so much, Señor Marroquin.
Mr. Marroquin, thank you very much for being here this morning. Thank you very much. Thank you very much, the Secretary, for conducting these proceedings and helping with the translation.
Procedural question, if you don't mind.
Yes.
The witness had expressed some interest in seeing oral arguments because he had never seen such a thing in the past. I don't know, we had discussed previously, but we had understood that that was okay. I just wanted to reconfirm that it was okay with the tribunal to do that.
We have no problem, and we also have some people who would probably like to see the oral argument as well. So I don't believe any of us plan on recalling any witnesses, and so certainly don't know of any reason why everyone couldn't watch if they want to.
Can we sell tickets and help pay for the cost?
That would probably require government subsidy.
Yes, you are big stars. I mean, you are being streamed worldwide.
Oh,
so
my God.
Why shouldn't Mr. Marroquin stay in the room?
You were described yesterday, or we were described yesterday, as a secret tribunal.
Actually, there were protesters yesterday calling it precisely that outside the World Bank, I understand.
But it was not for this case.
Not for this case.
so I think so that for the persons, for the council who are going to give the closing statements, and you can collect your thoughts, maybe we should have a 10 minutes recess and start in 10 minutes.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir.